This project I'm working on is a wedding plate, and as you can see, instead of kind of the more typical rosette in the middle, this design has a couple of opposite oak leaves around the couple's last name. And so I'll be working on this leaf area in this video. And first thing call out is you can see I already kind of carved out the relief chips. These are pretty good sized chips, you can see, compared with the knife, especially this one. Some of the other ones are kind of more medium sized, but the size of the chip combined with how irregular and kind of freeform they are is why I like to make sure to do the relief chip on these before getting started. And especially, you might notice how thin the black line is remaining here. This is going along the grain, and so if I leave too much thickness that I'm going to be cutting off along the grain, it's going to run ahead and kind of create rips instead of nice clean cuts. So I make sure to leave only a little, kind of a sliver of along the grain cut there left. It's a little bit of a bigger project here, so I'll do my best to keep it in frame. The other thing to mention kind of broadly on this design is for these freeform areas, I like to make sure to keep it as kind of shallow of cuts as I reasonably can. Again, with kind of the size and freeform nature of them, it can really kind of get away from you if you go with a more typical 65-degree angle. So kind of keeping these a little bit on the shallower side, and with how big they are, they'll still definitely create shadows and catch light. You're not going to miss the design from these being too shallow, so I'm not too worried about that. And right away on the end here, I'm just going to do this first section first rather than kind of going all the way around. And so I'm going to start here on the tip of the leaf, but it's a rounded part, and it transitions from across the grain to along the grain to with the grain. And so rather than doing that whole thing, I'm going to just slice off a little bit here along the grain, again to prevent that from ripping out. And now I can come back and transition that into this curve. And one thing you'll probably observe is usually takes several passes of the knife to get these chips to come out. They don't really come out cleanly in just one go, and that's perfectly fine with me. It just takes a little bit of patience to get it right. One nice thing about the freeform aspect of this design is it's not a precise geometric shape, so if I end up going off the line a little bit, doesn't really matter, since by the time I'm done, it'll remove all of the pattern lines. You won't really see where the original target was anyway. On this one, rather than coming this way, I see I've got a little bit of the grain lifting up already before I even get there, so I'm going to come at this section backwards. And then come back at it kind of the normal way. And some of these, like this one here, as I come around, I'm going to intentionally cut that off again to avoid that grain kind of ripping ahead on me. And it's going to create a kind of a point or a bit of a crease on the end of the leaf there that I'll come back in a second and clean that up, smooth that out so you don't see the change in cut. On this last bit, the end of the cut is over here, but I'm going to come in a little bit to break that off because I want to make sure that once I come back and do this other half, this is a nice clean smooth line. So if I were to cut this here, I'd have a hard time kind of matching and getting the knife exactly smooth there. So if I cut it off early, now I can do the rest of the cut all in one go. That'll look a little bit cleaner that way. So I can kind of come back and clean up some of these areas that I left a little rougher. Here's that leaf little segment that I stopped. I came this way and then came back that way, so there's a bit of a point. I want to round that off, so just very lightly taking the knife and kind of running it down the length of that pointed bit. Just barely removing a tiny layer of wood. And same thing on this one. And you don't even really notice that it used to, or that it was two different cuts that used to be pointy. Got a little bit of a crease or something going on right here. Take that off. Some of these you can see are kind of odd, irregular shaped chips that just got to kind of keep good technique. And I've got another video, carver's tip video, on how to handle irregular chips like that and know kind of where the bottom's going to be and what the bottom of the cut's going to look like. I'll link that up. And there's still, maybe a little bit of roughness down in here, but a lot of times some of the irregularities or undercuts or whatever that come from this stage. Once I add the first finishing product, the sanding sealer, that kind of gets into the grain and fills it out, so sometimes that gets evened up. And then it also kind of stabilizes the grain so it's less likely to chip and run and stuff. So anything that still needs to be cleaned up in here, I'll go ahead and do after I apply that sanding sealer. So now I can come in and do the outside here. And again, keeping the blade at a relatively shallower angle than I would normally use for chip carving. I'm going to stop right there because this is where the grain transitions, and with how kind of long and shallow of a cut this is, there's not really going to be a good way for me to continue that cut smoothly all the way without the knife kind of getting hung up in the grain and ripping it. So I'm going to go ahead and start on the other end now and kind of do the reverse cut. And it's always something to be aware of when doing the kind of backwards cut technique here, to make sure you're using the hitting as much of the same angle as you can compared to when you're carving in the normal direction. But especially for me on how large these chips are, if I miss by too much, it's going to become more obvious, I think, than if it were kind of the smaller typical size chips. And then make sure those cuts line up just like that. Make a nice smooth transition between those two. Now I can come along the inside of these. On the inside of these curves, it's kind of similar to making a circle. As I come across that grain transition, draw the knife out a bit and make the transition, and then push the knife back down to meet up with the first half of the cut. Like I said, these large irregular chips kind of make a mess of themselves and end up making several passes to get all the wood out, to get to the full depth and clear all the directions. So this is definitely not a beginner-friendly design. Alright, it's going to be just kind of more of the same as I run through the rest of the leaf, so I'll spray from that and move on to the kind of final part of the leaf here, which is doing the veins. And it's just these kind of long, thin, sort of etched lines, kind of a wiggly, organic sort of shape. Definitely don't want those to be particularly straight in this case. And if they're a bit irregular in width, that's okay too. And as I come into the middle here, this positive part kind of comes part way in, and then it goes away. So this outer part that I'm cutting, I need to be really careful right around here as it transitions to make sure I don't undercut the part of the... And now kind of doing the other side of just that little bit opposite the stem coming in. Just a little bit there, mesh up with the other one I did. And then it's kind of more of the same on those little etching cuts as I just follow all these other veins as they kind of wiggle around coming off of the main vein. And that won't be too exciting, but you can see what it looks like when it's done on this one.